Sometimes the greatest miracle doesn't begin with finding treasure. It begins with opening a door everyone else was too afraid to touch. The old farmhouse stood alone beneath a pale October sky, its weathered white paint peeling away like forgotten memories, its crooked front porch leaning slightly toward an overgrown pasture where waist-high grass swayed beneath a steady Midwestern breeze. Most people driving along County Road 14 never slowed down long enough to look at it twice. They called it cursed. They called it abandoned. Some claimed strange lights flickered behind the dusty windows after sunset, while others insisted the place had been empty for nearly 20 years. Ethan Walker believed none of those stories. He believed in mortgages, overdue bills, second-hand furniture, and the quiet promises a father made when no one else was listening. At 41 years old, Ethan had learned that life rarely rewarded people who waited for perfect opportunities. Sometimes all you could afford was an imperfect beginning. That was exactly why he had spent every dollar he had left buying the forgotten farmhouse sitting on 32 acres outside the small town of Millfield, Iowa. It wasn't because it was beautiful. It wasn't because it was practical. It was because it was the only place he could still call home after years of working overtime, selling nearly everything he owned, and trying to build a future for the one person who still believed he could fix anything. 9-year-old Lily Walker sat quietly in the passenger seat of his aging Ford F-150, hugging a faded stuffed rabbit against her chest as the truck rolled slowly across the cracked gravel driveway. Her golden hair caught the afternoon sunlight spilling through the dusty windshield, and her blue eyes studied the old house with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. "Is this really ours?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled, though exhaustion rested behind his eyes. "Every board, every window, every squeaky floor." Lily looked at the sagging porch and laughed. "Even the broken ones?" Ethan chuckled. "Especially the broken ones." She smiled wider than she had in weeks. That alone made every sacrifice worth it. He shut off the engine, and the silence that followed seemed almost alive. No highway noise. No city traffic. Only the rustling of cornfields in the distance, the chirping of late-season crickets, and the gentle creak of ancient oak branches stretching over the roof like patient guardians watching another family arrive. Ethan stepped out first, grabbing 2 duffel bags before walking around to help Lily from the truck. She immediately reached for his hand, something she still did whenever a place felt unfamiliar. He squeezed her fingers gently. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "As long as we're together." The words settled somewhere deep inside his heart. Since losing his wife 5 years earlier, there had been countless nights when he questioned whether he was enough. Enough father. Enough provider. Enough comfort for a little girl forced to grow up far too soon. Yet Lily never asked for perfection. She only asked that he stayed. Together they climbed the wooden porch steps. Each board groaned beneath their weight, releasing tiny clouds of dust into the cool autumn air. Ethan pulled an old brass key from his jacket pocket, turning it slowly inside the stubborn lock until it finally surrendered with a loud metallic click. The heavy front door resisted at first before easing inward with a long, tired creak that echoed through the empty house. Or at least, the house should have been empty. A faint warmth drifted across Ethan's face. Not heat from sunlight. Something softer. Something recent. He frowned. Lily stepped carefully behind him, clutching his arm. The air carried the unmistakable scent of burning candle wax mixed with fresh bread. Ethan froze. Farmhouses abandoned for decades did not smell like someone had baked that morning. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Dust floated through narrow beams of golden light slipping between faded curtains. A wooden rocking chair sat near the fireplace. A chipped coffee mug rested on a small table. A neatly folded gray blanket lay across the couch. None of those things should have been there. His heartbeat slowed instead of quickening, the strange calm of a man who had spent enough years surviving disappointment. That fear rarely arrived first anymore. Lily whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "Daddy." He turned toward her. Her small finger pointed beyond the living room toward the hallway disappearing into the shadows. "Someone is living here." And somewhere deeper inside the old farmhouse, almost too soft to hear above the whispering wind outside, came the unmistakable sound of gentle footsteps stopping all at once. Ethan slowly raised one hand in front of Lily, a silent gesture asking her to stay behind him while he listened. The house answered with stillness. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by the faint crackling of wood somewhere deeper inside, followed by the gentle ticking of an old clock that somehow still kept time. He cleared his throat, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Hello?" The word drifted through the hallway and disappeared into the quiet. No answer came back. Only the wind brushed softly against the loose shutters outside. Ethan looked toward Lily and offered a reassuring smile that was more determined than confident. "Stay right here for a second, sweetheart." She nodded, though her fingers tightened around the little stuffed rabbit she had carried since she was 4 years old. Ethan stepped farther into the living room, each worn floorboard creaking beneath his boots. Whoever had been living here was careful. The fireplace held fresh ashes that were still faintly warm. A kettle rested neatly on the iron grate. A pair of reading glasses sat beside an open Bible whose pages fluttered gently whenever the breeze slipped through tiny gaps in the old windows. None of it looked abandoned. Everything looked respected. Someone had cared for this place. That realization slowed his heartbeat even more. People who respected a home rarely wished harm upon anyone. They were usually trying to protect something they had almost lost. Ethan knew that feeling better than most. 5 years earlier, life had looked completely different. Back then he still wore his wedding ring every day without thinking about it. His wife, Hannah, filled every room with music while Lily danced barefoot across worn hardwood floors in the small rental house they could barely afford. Hannah always believed homes were built by laughter before lumber. She used to leave handwritten notes inside kitchen drawers just so Ethan would find them weeks later. One simply read, "Thank you for making ordinary days feel like adventures." He had never thrown it away. It still rested inside his wallet, folded so many times that the paper had become soft around the edges. When illness quietly entered their lives, everything changed one appointment at a time. The doctors were kind. Friends tried to help. Church members brought casseroles and prayers. But no amount of kindness could stop the empty chair that waited at the dinner table after Hannah was gone. Ethan remembered standing in the kitchen one rainy evening while Lily asked the question every father fears most. "Will Mommy know if I still sing her favorite songs?" Ethan had knelt beside his daughter, unable to stop tears from filling his own eyes. "She will always hear the ones you sing with love." From that day forward, every decision belonged to 2 people instead of 3. Ethan worked longer hours repairing farm equipment, skipped vacations, postponed replacing his aging truck, and quietly ignored every personal dream that required money. None of those sacrifices felt heavy whenever he watched Lily smile. She was the reason he kept moving forward. She was the reason this old farmhouse mattered so much. Renting another apartment in town would have been easier. Buying this forgotten property had been terrifying. It meant risking everything they had left. But it also meant giving Lily room to run beneath open skies instead of parking lots. It meant vegetable gardens instead of concrete sidewalks. It meant stars bright enough to count before bedtime. Hannah would have loved that. Ethan often imagined what she would have said if she could see the farmhouse. She probably would have laughed first. Then she would have walked through every dusty room talking about possibilities instead of problems. That had always been her gift. She never looked at what something was. She looked at what it could become. Lily suddenly whispered from behind him. "Daddy, look!" Ethan turned toward the dining room. On the old oak table stood 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea beside a loaf of homemade bread wrapped carefully in a clean linen towel. Someone had prepared them only minutes earlier. The warmth rising from the cups curled gently into the afternoon light. Whoever lived here had not expected company. Yet neither had they fled in panic. They had simply stepped away. Ethan walked closer, noticing something else beside the bread. A small glass vase held freshly picked wildflowers. Yellow daisies. Purple asters. Tiny white Queen Anne's lace. Simple flowers gathered with remarkable care. Lily smiled despite the uncertainty surrounding them. They are pretty. Ethan nodded quietly. Yes, they are. His voice softened almost to himself. Your mom used to pick flowers exactly like these. Lily looked down for a moment before taking a slow breath. Do you think whoever lives here misses someone too? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the little arrangement resting in the afternoon sunlight. Homes carried stories. So did the people inside them. Sometimes grief looked like broken furniture. Sometimes it looked like unpaid bills. And sometimes it looked like fresh flowers placed gently on an old table inside a house everyone else believed had been forgotten. Then, from somewhere upstairs, came the soft sound of a door opening. The upstairs door remained open for several long seconds before a figure slowly appeared at the top of the staircase. Ethan instinctively stepped half a pace in front of Lily, not out of fear but out of habit. Every father knew that quiet instinct, the one that placed his child behind him before his own mind had finished deciding whether danger truly existed. The woman standing above them did not look threatening. She looked exhausted. She wore a simple cream-colored sweater with the sleeves rolled to her forearms, faded blue jeans, and sturdy brown work boots that had clearly seen better days. Her light brown hair was gathered loosely behind her head, with a few strands escaping around a face marked more by sleepless nights than age. Her gray eyes settled first on Ethan, then on Lily, before dropping briefly toward the old wooden floor. As though she were searching for the right words. Neither side spoke. The farmhouse itself seemed to breathe between them. The old grandfather clock continued its patient rhythm somewhere beyond the dining room while sunlight drifted through the dusty windows, painting soft, golden lines across the worn staircase. Finally, the woman broke the silence. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "We did not know anyone was coming today." Ethan studied her voice as much as her face. There was no anger. No panic. Only calm honesty wrapped in quiet caution. Before he could answer, another pair of footsteps echoed from the hallway upstairs. A teenage boy appeared beside her, perhaps 16 years old, tall and lean, carrying a small toolbox against his side. His sandy blonde hair needed cutting, and his flannel shirt had several careful repairs stitched across one sleeve. He immediately placed himself slightly closer to the woman without saying a word. It was not an aggressive movement. It was protective. Ethan recognized it instantly because he had spent years making the same silent choice whenever Lily felt uncertain. The woman glanced toward the boy before looking back at Ethan. "My name is Grace Bennett," she said. "This is my younger brother Noah." Noah offered a polite nod. "Sir?" Ethan relaxed his shoulders just enough to let Lily step beside him again. "I am Ethan Walker. This is my daughter, Lily." Lily gave a shy little wave. Grace's expression softened almost immediately. "Hello, Lily." Lily smiled back with the quiet politeness Hannah had always encouraged. "Hi." The moment lasted only seconds, but something invisible shifted inside the room. Ethan noticed the way Grace looked at Lily, not with curiosity but with kindness. She did not see a stranger. She saw a child. Ethan trusted people who looked at children that way. Grace slowly descended the staircase, each step careful against the aging wood. Noah followed one pace behind, setting the toolbox gently beside the wall once he reached the bottom. Neither of them attempted to move closer than necessary. Respect filled the space between all four of them. Grace folded her hands together. "We never intended to cause trouble." Ethan nodded toward the dining room. "You have been taking care of this house." She looked around the old farmhouse before answering. "It has been taking care of us too." The words settled heavily in the quiet air. Ethan glanced toward the fresh flowers on the table and the warm fireplace. Suddenly everything fit together. This was not the carelessness of squatters destroying abandoned property. This was the work of people trying to preserve something beautiful while hiding from the world. Noah finally spoke, his voice steady but reserved. "The roof leaked when we first came here. We fixed most of it before the fall rains." Ethan looked upward almost automatically. He had expected to spend thousands replacing sections of rotten timber. "You repaired the roof?" Noah nodded once. Only what we could. Ethan walked toward the front window, noticing details he had overlooked earlier. Several loose floorboards had been reinforced. The broken latch beside the back door had been replaced with an older but functional piece of hardware. Even the faded curtains had been carefully washed. Someone had invested time instead of money. Ethan understood that kind of investment. It was often the only one struggling people could afford. Grace took a slow breath. When we found this place last spring, everyone believed it had been abandoned forever. We stayed because we had nowhere else to go. Ethan remained quiet. Grace continued carefully. We planned to leave before winter. We simply needed a little more time. Noah lowered his eyes toward the floor. We never wanted to steal from anyone. Ethan noticed something then that surprised him. Their backpacks rested neatly beside the staircase. Only 2 backpacks. 1 small suitcase. 1 toolbox. Everything they owned fit inside a single corner of the room. Lily gently tugged on Ethan's sleeve. He bent slightly so only she could whisper into his ear. "Daddy," she murmured. "I do not think they are bad people." Ethan looked at his daughter before looking back toward Grace and Noah. Children often notice truth before adults complicated it with suspicion. He remembered Hannah saying that more than once. Grace reached into her sweater pocket and slowly removed a small ring of old house keys. She held them out toward Ethan with both hands. "This belongs to you now," she said softly. "We will leave before sunset." Ethan stared at the worn keys resting in her open palms. Outside, the autumn wind stirred through the tall grass surrounding the farmhouse, carrying the scent of harvested corn and distant apple orchards across the fields. Inside, no one moved. No one argued. No one pleaded. Grace simply stood there prepared to surrender the only shelter she and her brother had known for months. And for reasons Ethan could not fully explain, the last thing his heart wanted to do was take those keys. For several quiet seconds, Ethan simply looked at the old keys resting in Grace's hands. They were scratched with age, attached to a faded leather tag whose writing had disappeared long ago. They looked less like keys and more like the final thread connecting 2 weary people to a place that had quietly sheltered them when the rest of the world had not. Ethan slowly closed Grace's fingers around them again. "Keep them," he said gently. Grace blinked in surprise. "This is your home now." Ethan nodded. "Legally, yes. But a house does not become a home because someone signs papers at a courthouse." The room fell silent once more. Noah glanced toward his sister, clearly uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Grace lowered her voice. "You do not understand. We cannot stay." Ethan smiled with the calm patience that years of fatherhood had taught him. "Then help me understand." Grace hesitated. She looked toward the windows as if expecting someone to appear outside before finally speaking. "People always assume the worst when they find strangers living somewhere they do not belong." Ethan folded his arms loosely. "Maybe they do." Grace looked back at him. "You should probably assume the same." Ethan shook his head. "I stopped making decisions based on assumptions a long time ago." Lily quietly stepped closer to Grace and looked up at her with the innocent honesty only children carried. "Did you make the bread?" Grace looked surprised by the unexpected question before smiling softly. "Yes." Lily's eyes brightened. "It smells like the bread my mommy used to bake on Saturdays." Grace's smile faded into something gentler, touched by sadness and warmth at the same time. "Your mother must have been a wonderful baker." Lily nodded proudly. "Daddy says she made every house feel happy." Ethan looked away for a brief moment, gathering himself before speaking again. "She did." Grace understood there was a story behind those few words, but she did not ask. Some grief deserved patience before questions. Noah broke the silence by clearing his throat. "We can leave after we clean everything." Ethan looked toward the repaired ceiling beams and sturdy window frames. "Looks to me like you have already done more cleaning than I ever expected." Noah shrugged modestly. "It felt wrong to stay somewhere without fixing what we could." Ethan could not help smiling. My father used to say that if you borrow a place from life, you leave it better than you found it. Noah gave the smallest smile of his own. Mine said something similar. The simple exchange settled comfortably between them. Outside, a cool breeze swept across the fields, rattling the dried corn stalks in the distance while a flock of birds drifted slowly across the pale blue sky. Autumn had a way of reminding people that change could be beautiful without being loud. Ethan walked toward the kitchen window, looking across the wide pasture stretching beyond the weathered barn. There was more work waiting outside than one man could finish before winter. Fence posts leaned at odd angles. Sections of the barn roof still needed replacing. The orchard had not been pruned in years. He had known all of that before buying the property. What he had not expected was finding two people who had already started bringing the place back to life. He turned around again. How long have you been here? Grace answered honestly. Almost 6 months. Through the summer? She nodded. We planted vegetables in the back garden. There should still be potatoes and carrots ready to harvest. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You planted a garden? Noah spoke quietly. We figured someone should. Lily looked out the window excitedly. Daddy, can we have pumpkins next year? Ethan laughed softly. Only if we can keep the squirrels from stealing them first. Lily giggled, and for the first time since entering the farmhouse, everyone else smiled too. It was a small sound, but it changed the atmosphere completely. The house no longer felt like strangers sharing the same space. It felt like lonely people remembering what ordinary conversation sounded like. Grace looked down at the keys still resting in her hand. You really are not asking us to leave? Ethan answered without hesitation. Not tonight. Grace searched his face carefully, almost expecting a condition hidden somewhere behind his kindness. Why? Ethan looked toward Lily before answering. Because there were moments after my wife passed away when complete strangers helped my daughter and me without asking what we could give them in return. He paused, remembering faces he had never properly thanked. One neighbor fixed my truck without charging me. Another left groceries on my porch every Sunday for nearly 2 months. They never signed their names. They simply helped because someone once helped them. Grace listened quietly. Ethan continued. Kindness has a way of traveling farther than the people who begin it. Noah lowered his eyes. Grace took a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper. We do not have money to pay rent. Ethan smiled. Good. Because I was not planning to ask for any. She looked genuinely confused. Ethan pointed toward the fields outside. If you truly want to earn your place here for a little while, help me bring this old farm back to life. Noah looked out toward the weathered barn with something that resembled hope returning to his face for the first time in months. Grace remained still, her eyes beginning to glisten as though a burden she had carried for far too long had suddenly become lighter. She looked around the farmhouse one more time before quietly saying the words she never imagined she would speak again. Then, if it is truly all right with you, we would like to help. Ethan nodded once. Welcome home, at least for now. The next morning arrived quietly, wrapped in silver mist that drifted across the fields like a gentle blanket settling over forgotten memories. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the old farmhouse windows, warming the worn pine floors with soft, golden light. Ethan had been awake long before dawn, just as he had been every weekday for years. Habit had become part of who he was. He quietly brewed coffee in the old kitchen while the comforting aroma filled every corner of the house. For the first time in many years, however, the silence inside the farmhouse no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. He heard light footsteps behind him and turned to see Grace tying an apron around her waist. She smiled politely. I hope you do not mind. I started making breakfast. Ethan looked toward the stove where fresh biscuits baked beside scrambled eggs and sliced apples. You certainly know how to make someone feel welcome in his own kitchen. Grace laughed softly, a sound that seemed unfamiliar even to herself. It has been a long time since I cooked for more than Noah and me. A few minutes later Lily skipped downstairs with her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm. She stopped halfway across the room, breathing deeply before smiling. It smells like Saturday. Ethan looked at her curiously. Saturday? Lily nodded. Mommy always made biscuits on Saturdays. Grace glanced toward Ethan, unsure whether she had unintentionally awakened painful memories. Instead, Ethan smiled gently. Then I think Hannah would approve. Soon Noah entered carrying a worn notebook and a pencil tucked behind one ear. I walked around the property before sunrise, he said. There are 3 sections of fence that need replacing before winter, and the old barn doors need reinforcing if we want to keep snow out. Ethan looked impressed. You already inspected the farm? Noah shrugged. Could not sleep. Ethan poured him a cup of coffee before remembering Noah's age and quickly exchanged it for hot chocolate instead. Noah smiled awkwardly. Thank you. They gathered around the old dining table, sharing the first breakfast the farmhouse had hosted in years. Conversation came naturally, interrupted occasionally by laughter when Lily proudly explained how she intended to adopt every stray kitten she might find in the barn. Grace smiled more often than she spoke, quietly watching the father and daughter interact. She noticed the little habits between them. Ethan always waited until Lily served herself before taking his own plate. Lily always reached for his hand before saying grace. Neither realized they still carried traditions Hannah had once begun. After breakfast the work began. Ethan handed Noah a measuring tape, a hammer, and several boxes of reclaimed nails he had purchased at an estate sale. Together they walked toward the weathered barn while crisp autumn air carried the scent of fresh hay and distant cedar trees across the property. Think we can save this old place? Ethan asked. Noah ran his fingers across one of the heavy wooden support beams. Most people replace things too quickly. He smiled slightly. Old wood usually wants one more chance. Ethan looked at him with quiet respect. That sounds like something my grandfather used to say. Noah smiled without answering. Across the yard Grace wandered toward the neglected garden carrying gardening gloves and a small shovel. Months earlier she had planted vegetables simply to survive. Today she planted with a different purpose. She carefully removed weeds surrounding rows of carrots, trimmed dying tomato vines, and gathered seeds from late summer flowers before winter claimed them. Lily followed close behind carrying a tiny watering can almost as large as her arms. Can I help? She asked. Grace knelt beside her. The flowers need someone gentle. Lily immediately began watering each plant with complete concentration. Grace watched her smile at every blossom as though each one deserved its own conversation. Mom always talked to flowers, Lily said suddenly. Grace looked at her. Really? Lily nodded. Daddy used to tease her because he said flowers could not hear. Ethan called from the barn without looking up. I was wrong. Lily giggled loudly. Grace laughed with her, and the sound floated across the farmyard like music the old farmhouse had waited years to hear again. By late afternoon the property looked noticeably different. Broken fence rails had been stacked neatly for repair. Fallen branches had been cleared from the orchard. Windows reflected sunlight instead of dirt. Even the old front porch seemed somehow straighter simply because people had begun caring for it again. Ethan stood near the well, wiping sweat from his forehead while admiring everything they had accomplished in a single day. I thought this would take weeks, he admitted. Noah leaned against the repaired fence. Many hands make lighter work. Grace joined them carrying a basket filled with vegetables harvested from the garden. Fresh carrots, potatoes, onions, and herbs rested inside beside a handful of bright orange pumpkins no larger than softballs. Looks like dinner found us first, Ethan joked. Lily ran across the yard holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered herself. She handed them proudly to Grace. These are for you. Grace accepted them carefully, as though receiving something priceless. Thank you, Lily. The little girl looked up with complete sincerity. Flowers should never be lonely. Grace felt her throat tighten. She had spent months believing loneliness was something people simply learned to carry forever. Yet standing there beneath the wide Iowa sky, surrounded by ordinary kindness, she wondered if perhaps loneliness could slowly be unlearned as well. As the sun dipped lower behind the maple trees, painting the farmhouse in warm shades of amber and gold, Ethan noticed something he had not expected. The old place no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. And for reasons none of them fully understood, it felt as though the farmhouse itself had been waiting not for owners, but for a family. 3 peaceful days passed with the quiet rhythm that only country life seemed capable of creating. Every sunrise brought another list of small repairs, another shared breakfast, another reminder that healing rarely arrived all at once. It arrived one ordinary morning after another. Ethan often caught himself smiling without realizing it. The farmhouse no longer echoed with emptiness. Lily's laughter drifted through the hallways. Noah's hammer rang steadily from the barn. Grace hummed softly while hanging laundry beneath the wide Iowa sky, melodies she probably did not even realize she remembered. It felt almost too good to question. Yet small towns had a way of noticing every unfamiliar face long before anyone introduced themselves. On Thursday morning, Ethan drove into Millfield to pick up lumber, chicken feed, and fresh nails from the hardware store. The town square looked exactly as it always had. American flags fluttered outside brick storefronts. Pickup trucks lined the streets. Neighbors greeted one another by first name before they even reached the sidewalk. As Ethan loaded supplies into his truck, someone called out behind him, "Well, if it is not the new owner of the old Carter place." Ethan turned to find Harold Simmons, owner of the local feed store, approaching with an easy smile beneath his weathered cowboy hat. "Getting settled?" Harold asked. Ethan nodded. "Slowly but surely." Harold chuckled. "That farm has needed somebody stubborn enough to love it." Before Ethan could answer, another voice joined the conversation. Martha Jenkins, who seemed to know every piece of news before it officially became news, folded her arms beside the hardware store entrance. "I heard you have company out there." Ethan looked toward her politely. "A couple of people helping with repairs." Martha exchanged a glance with Harold. "Helping?" she repeated carefully. Ethan sensed the conversation shifting. "Yes." Martha lowered her voice. "People have noticed a young woman and a teenage boy around your place." Ethan remained calm. "Their names are Grace and Noah." "Do you know who they are?" she asked. Ethan answered honestly. "I know enough." Martha frowned. "Sometimes enough is not enough." Harold looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing the conversation would end differently. Ethan simply closed the tailgate of his truck. "They have been respectful, hard-working, and kind to my daughter." Martha sighed. "People are talking, Ethan." He smiled gently. "Small towns usually do." She hesitated before speaking again. "Nobody knows where they came from." Ethan looked across the quiet main street where children rode bicycles past the courthouse lawn. Sometimes people deserve the chance to tell their own story before someone else invents one for them. Harold nodded thoughtfully. Martha did not argue further, but concern remained written across her face. Ethan drove home carrying more than lumber in the back of his truck. He carried the realization that curiosity was beginning to spread. Back at the farmhouse, Grace was kneeling beside the vegetable garden when she heard the truck pull into the driveway. She immediately noticed something different in Ethan's expression. Not fear. Not anger. Just thoughtful silence. "Long morning?" she asked as he unloaded the lumber. Ethan smiled. "Depends on how much you enjoy conversations." Noah stepped forward to help carry several boards toward the barn. "Something happened in town?" Ethan nodded once. "People noticed you both." Grace lowered her eyes toward the soil beneath her gloves. She had expected this day from the beginning. She simply hoped it would come later. Lily ran across the yard carrying a tiny basket filled with apples gathered from one of the surviving orchard trees. "Look what I found." She stopped after noticing the quiet expressions around her. "Did I interrupt?" Ethan knelt beside her. "Not at all." He took one apple from the basket and smiled. "Looks like this old orchard still has surprises." Lily grinned proudly before skipping toward the porch. Grace watched her disappear inside before speaking quietly. "This is exactly why we should leave." Ethan looked at her without answering. She continued softly. Your neighbors trusted you before we arrived. I do not want that to change because of us. Noah placed another board onto the growing stack beside the barn. People always become suspicious when they cannot explain someone. Ethan rested both hands on the truck bed for a long moment before looking at them. Do you know what my wife used to say whenever rumors started? Grace shook her head. Ethan smiled faintly. She said gossip grows fastest where compassion is planted the least. Grace almost laughed despite herself. She sounds like someone I would have liked. Ethan looked toward the farmhouse window where an old family photograph now rested on the windowsill. You would have. The afternoon continued. With quiet work, yet Grace seemed distracted. More than once Ethan noticed her studying the long gravel road leading toward the highway. Every passing vehicle caused her shoulders to stiffen slightly before relaxing again. She was listening for something only she understood. Later, while organizing tools inside the barn, Ethan noticed Noah carefully reinforcing an old wooden chest that had been left behind by the previous owners. You repair everything, Ethan observed. Noah smiled modestly. Some things deserve another chance before people throw them away. Ethan nodded slowly. You sound. The following morning began with a strange stillness that Ethan could not explain. Even before sunrise, the farm felt as though it was holding its breath. The usual chorus of birds was quieter than normal, and the breeze that usually carried the scent of fresh earth across the fields barely stirred the tall grass surrounding the old farmhouse. Ethan stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee, watching pale ribbons of fog drift lazily over the pasture. He had learned long ago that peaceful moments often arrived just before life changed again. Behind him, the screen door opened softly. Grace joined him with a light sweater wrapped around her shoulders. Neither of them spoke at first. They simply watched the first golden light climb over the distant hills. It is beautiful here, Grace said quietly. Ethan nodded. That is why I bought it. She smiled faintly. No. He looked toward her. That is why you stayed. Grace lowered her eyes, unable to disagree. Before either of them could continue, the distant sound of an engine rolled across the quiet countryside. It was not the familiar rumble of Harold Simmons' old pickup or the school bus that passed every weekday. This engine was smoother, quieter, more expensive. Ethan turned toward the gravel road. A large black sport utility vehicle appeared between rows of maple trees before slowly making its way toward the farmhouse. Dust lifted gently behind its tires, hanging in the cool morning air. Grace's face lost its color almost instantly. The warmth disappeared from her expression, replaced by a calm that looked carefully practiced. Noah stepped out of the barn carrying a toolbox, but the moment he saw the approaching vehicle, he stopped walking. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes never left the road. Lily came skipping out the front door holding a basket filled with freshly gathered eggs before noticing the silence surrounding the adults. Who is visiting? She asked cheerfully. Nobody answered. The vehicle rolled to a slow stop beside the front gate instead of driving all the way to the house. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit stepped out, closing the door with deliberate care. He appeared to be somewhere in his early 50s, his silver hair neatly combed, his polished shoes strangely out of place against the dusty gravel. He did not look angry. He looked determined. Ethan walked a few steps forward while Grace remained completely still behind him. The man removed his sunglasses before speaking. Good morning. Ethan nodded politely. Morning. The man glanced briefly toward the farmhouse before returning his attention to Ethan. My name is Richard Collins. His voice was calm, professional, and carefully measured. I apologize for arriving unannounced. Ethan waited. Richard looked past him, his eyes settling on Grace. Something almost imperceptible softened in his expression. Miss Bennet. Grace did not answer. Richard continued quietly. We have been searching for you for months. Noah stepped closer to his sister without saying a word. Ethan noticed the movement immediately. It was not fear. It was loyalty. Richard noticed it too. He slowly raised both empty hands in a peaceful gesture. I am not here to force anyone to do anything. Grace finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tension beneath it. Then why are you here? Richard sighed gently. Because there are people who are worried about you. Grace gave the smallest shake of her head. No. They are worried about something else. The wind carried her words away across the fields. Richard remained silent for several long seconds before speaking again. May we talk? Ethan looked toward Grace. He had no intention of making the decision for her. She appreciated that more than he realized. After a moment she nodded. Once. Outside. Richard agreed immediately. They walked only a short distance toward the old oak tree overlooking the pasture while Ethan remained on the porch with Lily and Noah. None of them could hear the conversation clearly, only scattered pieces carried by the breeze. Richard spoke quietly, his posture respectful. Grace listened with folded arms, occasionally answering with brief sentences. More than once Richard appeared to plead with her. More than once she quietly refused. Lily tugged gently on Ethan's sleeve. Is Miss Grace in trouble? Ethan looked toward the distant figures beneath the oak tree. I do not know. Lily frowned thoughtfully. She does not look like someone who wants to hurt anybody. Ethan smiled gently. Neither do I. Noah remained silent, watching every movement near the tree with. That evening the farmhouse settled into an unusual silence. Even Lily, who normally filled every room with cheerful questions, sensed that something important had changed. After dinner she quietly carried her favorite storybook upstairs, leaving the adults alone in the kitchen while the old clock ticked steadily above the fireplace. Outside, the last light of day faded behind the rolling hills, painting the fields in deep shades of amber before surrendering to a cool autumn dusk. Ethan poured 2 cups of hot tea and placed one gently in front of Grace. She looked at the steaming cup for several moments before wrapping both hands around it as though welcoming its warmth. Noah quietly excused himself and stepped onto the back porch, giving his sister privacy without being asked. Ethan remained patient. He had learned years earlier that some stories only appeared after silence had been given enough room to breathe. Grace finally reached into her sweater pocket and placed the cream-colored business card on the table between them. Ethan glanced down at the elegant lettering before looking back at her. You do not have to explain anything if you are not ready. Grace smiled faintly. That is exactly why I think I should. She stared out the kitchen window where the porch light reflected softly against the glass. My father built Bennett Legacy Holdings from almost nothing. Farms. Grain elevators. Food processing plants. Land. Eventually it became one of the largest privately owned agricultural companies in the Midwest. Ethan listened quietly. Grace continued without looking at him. People always assumed growing up in that family meant life was easy. She shook her head gently. Money can build beautiful houses, but it cannot force people to become a family. The words hung quietly between them. Ethan recognized the sadness beneath them. Grace took a slow breath before continuing. After my parents died, everything changed. Lawyers arrived. Advisors arrived. Executives arrived. Everyone talked about assets, voting rights, and succession plans. She looked down at her tea. Almost nobody talked about grief. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that kind of loneliness. Grace folded her hands together. Noah was only 13. I became responsible for him overnight. Her voice softened. Every meeting seemed to end with someone explaining why we should trust them. She smiled sadly. The strange thing was that the more people promised to protect us, the less safe we felt. Ethan remained silent. Grace appreciated that. She did not need sympathy. She simply needed someone willing to hear the truth without interrupting it. Richard Collins was my father's attorney for more than 20 years. She explained. He is one of the few people I still believe is honest. Ethan looked surprised. Then why run from him? Grace answered almost immediately. Because he was never the one I was running from. At that moment Noah quietly returned from the porch, carrying an old wooden box he had retrieved from upstairs. He placed it carefully on the kitchen table before sitting beside his sister. Grace rested one hand gently on the lid. There were others inside the company who believed Noah and I would be easier to influence if we stayed surrounded by their decisions. Ethan frowned slightly. Influence? Noah gave a tired smile that seemed far older than 16 years. Everyone wanted us to sign papers. Grace nodded. New trusts. New management agreements. New appointments. Every week there was another document. She looked directly at Ethan. None of it felt wrong on paper. She paused. It just never felt right in our hearts. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. So you left? Grace smiled softly. One night Noah looked at me and asked a question. She glanced toward her brother. Noah finished the memory himself. If we already have everything people keep fighting over, why do we feel like we have nothing? The kitchen fell silent again. Ethan had no answer because the question needed none. Grace carefully opened the wooden box. Inside were photographs, handwritten letters, and several old family journals tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. Ethan noticed there was not a single stack of financial records. Only memories. Grace lifted one photograph showing a younger version of herself standing beside her parents in front of a farmhouse remarkably similar to the one where they now sat. This was my grandmother's farm, she whispered. Before corporations. Before boardrooms. Before anyone measured life by quarterly reports. She smiled through glistening eyes. She used to tell me that land remembers the people who love it. Ethan looked around the old kitchen with new understanding. That is why this place felt familiar to you. Grace nodded. The moment I found this farmhouse, something inside me became quiet for the first time in years. Noah reached into the box and removed a folded map. He spread it carefully across the table. Ethan noticed dozens of handwritten notes, made in faded blue ink. Our grandmother collected forgotten farms, Noah explained. She believed abandoned places deserved second chances too. Ethan smiled gently. She sounds like someone I would have enjoyed meeting. Noah returned the smile. You would have. Grace closed the box again. Richard wants us to come back because legal decisions still need to be made. He believes everything can be resolved fairly. Ethan asked softly. Do you believe that? Grace thought for a long moment before answering. I believe Richard is trying to do what is right. She looked toward the dark fields beyond the window. I am simply not sure the world waiting for us remembers what right actually feels like anymore. Upstairs a floorboard creaked as Lily wandered sleepily to the hallway. Daddy? She called softly. Ethan stood immediately. I am here, sweetheart. Before climbing the stairs he looked once more toward Grace and Noah. Neither of them appeared relieved after telling the truth. They simply looked lighter, as though honesty itself had removed a weight they had carried for far too long. But after Ethan disappeared upstairs, Noah quietly reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a small piece of paper he had hidden since Richard's visit. It contained only one handwritten sentence, "They know where you are now." The note remained on the kitchen table long after Noah unfolded it. He stared at the single sentence without speaking, as though the words themselves carried a weight too heavy to measure. Grace slowly reached across the table, picked up the paper, and read it twice before quietly closing her eyes. She did not appear surprised. She appeared disappointed. Ethan returned from upstairs a few moments later after making sure Lily had fallen asleep. One glance at Grace's face told him something had changed. He noticed the folded paper resting beside her hand. Bad news? He asked gently. Grace hesitated before sliding the note across the table. Ethan read the message carefully. They know where you are now. He looked up. Who sent this? Noah shook his head. I found it tucked beneath the windshield wiper on Richard's vehicle after he left. Nobody saw me pick it up. Ethan studied the handwriting. It revealed nothing familiar. No signature. No explanation. Just 7 quiet words meant to create fear. He folded the paper once and placed it beside the old wooden box. Sometimes people use mystery because they have nothing stronger than uncertainty. Grace managed a faint smile. You always sound calmer than everyone else. Ethan shrugged gently. Being calm does not mean I understand everything. It simply means panic has never solved much. The next morning arrived bright and unusually warm for late October. Sunlight spread across the fields while a gentle breeze carried the scent of drying hay through the open windows. For several peaceful hours life seemed almost ordinary again. Noah continued repairing the western fence. Grace harvested herbs from the garden while Lily happily followed behind collecting colorful leaves she insisted would become decorations for the dining room. Ethan spent the morning reinforcing the old barn doors exactly as Noah had recommended. The steady rhythm of hammers, laughter, and rustling trees almost convinced everyone that yesterday had simply been another passing worry. Shortly after noon, the distant sound of engines drifted across the countryside. Ethan climbed down from the ladder and looked toward the long gravel driveway. This time it was not one vehicle. It was several. 3 black sport utility vehicles followed by 2 dark sedans slowly approached the farmhouse before stopping neatly beside the front pasture. None of them drove recklessly. None of them sounded their horns. Everything about their arrival was organized, deliberate, and strangely respectful. Lily shaded her eyes with one hand. "Daddy, that is a lot of visitors." Ethan smiled gently. "It certainly is." Grace had already stopped gathering herbs. The basket rested forgotten at her feet. Noah quietly walked toward her, standing beside his sister exactly as he always did whenever uncertainty arrived. One by one the vehicle doors opened. Several professionally dressed men and women stepped onto the gravel. Some carried briefcases. Others held document folders. A few appeared to be assistants. Finally, Richard Collins emerged from the lead vehicle. He removed his sunglasses before approaching slowly, stopping several yards from Ethan rather than assuming permission to come closer. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker." Ethan nodded politely. "Good afternoon." Richard looked toward Grace. "Miss Bennet." Grace answered with a calm nod. Richard glanced briefly toward the group waiting behind him. "I apologize for bringing so many people." Ethan folded his arms comfortably. "Looks like an important meeting." Richard offered a small smile. "It may become one." Grace spoke before anyone else could continue. "I told you I was not ready." Richard answered quietly. "I know." He took a careful breath. "That is why I brought everyone here." "Instead of asking you to come back." Several of the visitors exchanged respectful glances but remained completely silent. Ethan noticed something unusual. No one appeared impatient. No one interrupted Richard. They waited. Grace looked toward the assembled group with understandable caution. Richard slowly turned toward them. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we discuss business, there is something all of you need to see." He gestured toward the farmhouse, the repaired porch, the restored garden, the straightened fence, and finally toward Ethan, who stood quietly beside Lily. For 6 months Miss Bennet and Mr. Noah Bennet disappeared from every office, boardroom, and legal meeting connected to Bennet Legacy Holdings. He paused. Many assumed they were avoiding responsibility. The group remained silent. Richard continued. "Instead, they came here." He looked toward the farmhouse again. "They repaired a forgotten home. They planted gardens. They rebuilt fences. They chose ordinary life over extraordinary wealth." A woman wearing a navy business suit quietly lowered her eyes. Another man slowly removed his glasses as though seeing the farm differently for the first time. Richard's voice softened. "Some of you have spent months debating ownership, voting shares, executive appointments, and financial projections." He looked directly at them. Meanwhile, the 2 people at the center of those discussions have been reminding themselves what their parents were actually trying to build. Ethan glanced toward Grace. She looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed by the attention. Lily tugged gently on Ethan's sleeve and whispered, "Why are they all looking at Miss Grace?" Ethan smiled quietly. "Because sometimes people forget that titles belong on paper. Character belongs in people." Richard reached into his briefcase and carefully removed a thick leather folder embossed with the Bennet Legacy seal. He held it respectfully rather than dramatically. "Miss Bennet," he said. Yesterday I intended to convince you to return. He smiled gently. Today I came because everyone else needed to understand why you left. A long silence settled across the farm. Even the wind seemed to pause among the maple trees. Finally, one elderly gentleman stepped forward from the group. His silver hair caught the afternoon sunlight as he removed his hat before speaking. "Miss Bennet," he said sincerely, "we owe you an apology." Grace looked genuinely surprised. The man lowered his head respectfully. "Some of us became so focused on protecting the company that we forgot to protect the people entrusted to lead it." No one argued. No one defended themselves. The quiet carried more honesty than any speech could have. Then Richard slowly opened the leather folder, revealing an aged property map covered with handwritten notes and official county seals. For several long moments, no one spoke. The autumn wind moved gently through the tall grass, carrying the scent of dry leaves across the old farm, while every pair of eyes slowly drifted toward the weathered farmhouse standing quietly behind Ethan. What had looked like a forgotten building only days before now seemed to carry an entirely different presence. Richard carefully unfolded the century-old property map across the hood of one of the parked vehicles. The paper had yellowed with age, its edges softened by decades of careful handling. Thin blue lines marked the original fields, orchards, and barns that once stretched across thousands of acres. Ethan stepped closer beside Grace while Noah quietly studied the faded handwriting scattered across the map. Richard rested one finger on a small square drawn near the center. "This house," he said gently, "was built by your great-great-grandfather, Samuel Bennet, in the spring of 1912. Grace looked down at the familiar shape of the farmhouse, unable to believe what she was seeing. Richard continued. "Long before Bennet Legacy Holdings became a corporation, this was simply a family farm. Samuel believed that no harvest mattered unless every worker ate at the same table." One of the elderly board members smiled quietly. "My grandfather worked here as a young man. He used to tell me stories about Sunday dinners where nobody was ever asked how much money they had." Ethan listened without interrupting. Richard carefully opened another folder and removed several old black and white photographs. The first showed the farmhouse nearly identical to the way it appeared now, except surrounded by healthy orchards and freshly painted fences. Another photograph showed dozens of farm workers standing together beneath the large oak tree where Grace had spoken with Richard only the day before. Children laughed beside horses while families shared homemade meals beneath long wooden tables. Grace stared at the images with growing emotion. "My grandmother showed me these when I was little," she whispered. "I thought they had all been lost." Richard smiled warmly. "She made certain they were preserved." Noah gently picked up one photograph and frowned thoughtfully. "There is something written on the back." Richard nodded. "Read it." Noah carefully turned the photograph over and quietly read the faded sentence written in elegant blue ink. "Land is never truly owned. It is simply entrusted to people who choose to love it well." Silence settled once again. Ethan slowly looked across the repaired fences, the restored garden, and the old porch where Lily now sat swinging her feet while watching butterflies drift across the yard. None of them had known they were living inside the very beginning of the Bennet family story. Richard looked toward Grace with quiet sincerity. "Your grandmother instructed that this property could never be sold separately from the original family trust." Grace looked up in surprise. "Then how did I buy it?" Ethan asked gently. Richard smiled. "Because nobody realized what they had." Several members of the board lowered their heads with visible embarrassment. Richard continued. "Years ago, an accounting error transferred the farmhouse into a neglected holding company scheduled for liquidation. It passed through several legal transactions before eventually reaching the county tax auction." Ethan folded his arms thoughtfully. "So I bought it legally?" "Yes," Richard answered immediately. "Every document was completely valid." Grace quietly exhaled with relief. Richard closed the folder before continuing. "However, the discovery of these original trust records changes one important detail." Ethan looked at him calmly. "Which is?" Richard gestured toward the surrounding fields. This farmhouse is not valuable because of the building itself. He unfolded another map showing the surrounding region. Colored markings extended far beyond the 32 acres Ethan had purchased. The original homestead serves as the legal cornerstone connecting more than 12,000 acres of agricultural easements, conservation agreements, historical protections, and family trust properties established over 4 generations. Even Ethan raised his eyebrows. Noah stared silently at the map. Grace slowly shook her head. I never knew. Richard smiled gently. Almost nobody did. One of the attorneys stepped forward carrying another leather portfolio. Current independent appraisals placed the combined protected holdings at approximately $1.8 billion. No one reacted with excitement. Instead, everyone looked toward the modest farmhouse where paint still peeled from the porch railing and Lily's tiny rain boots rested beside the front door. The contrast seemed almost impossible to understand. Richard turned toward Ethan. Mr. Walker, had you known any of this before purchasing the property? Ethan smiled softly. If I had, I probably could not have afforded the closing costs. Quiet laughter spread gently through the gathered group, easing the tension for the first time all afternoon. Richard nodded with obvious respect. Exactly the answer I expected. Grace looked toward Ethan with grateful eyes. You bought this place because you wanted your daughter to have a home. Ethan nodded. Nothing more. Richard looked around the farm one last time. And yet, because of that simple decision, you unknowingly preserved the one place our founders believed represented everything this family was supposed to stand for. Lily wandered over carrying another small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered from beside the orchard. She looked at the serious faces surrounding the old map before quietly asking, Did somebody lose something? Everyone smiled. Grace knelt beside her and gently tucked one loose strand of hair behind Lily's ear. Yes, she answered softly. For a long time, I think we all did. Lily handed her the flowers. Then maybe you found it again. Grace accepted the bouquet, unable to speak for several seconds. Richard carefully closed the final folder before addressing everyone present. There is still one matter requiring Miss Bennet's decision. Grace looked toward him. Richard's voice became respectful and formal. Under the original trust provisions, you now have the legal authority to reclaim this farmhouse, every surrounding protected parcel, and complete executive control of Bennett Legacy Holdings. He paused before looking toward Ethan. Or you may choose another path entirely. The breeze lifted softly across the fields as every person standing there waited, knowing that whatever Grace decided next would change far more than ownership papers. The quiet that followed Richard's announcement lingered across the farmhouse like the final notes of an old hymn. Nobody hurried Grace. Nobody interrupted the silence. Even the breeze seemed to move more gently through the maple trees, carrying fallen leaves across the porch where Lily sat swinging her legs, completely unaware that the adults around her were discussing decisions worth more money than she could possibly imagine. Grace slowly walked away from the gathered group and crossed the yard alone. Her boots brushed softly through the tall grass until she reached the old oak tree overlooking the fields. It was the same place where she had stood only days earlier, believing she would soon disappear again. Now the entire future seemed to be waiting beneath its branches. Ethan remained where he was until Richard quietly stepped beside him. She always thinks before she speaks, Richard said with a faint smile. Ethan nodded. The best people usually do. Richard looked toward the farmhouse. You have changed something inside her. Ethan shook his head gently. No. I think this place reminded her who she already was. Richard smiled with quiet agreement. Several minutes passed before Grace finally turned around. She looked first toward Noah, then toward Lily, and finally toward Ethan. There was peace in her eyes now. Not certainty about every tomorrow, but certainty about the next step. She walked back slowly until she stood before Richard. May I ask one question? Richard nodded immediately. Anything. Grace glanced toward the farmhouse before speaking. If I reclaim everything exactly as the trust allows, what happens to Mr. Walker? Richard answered without hesitation. Legally, the farmhouse ownership can be challenged through the historical trust. Ethan remained completely calm. Grace continued. Would he lose his home? Richard lowered his eyes for a brief moment before answering honestly. It is possible. Silence returned. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. The attorneys looked toward the ground. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak. Grace looked toward Ethan. You knew this could happen? Ethan smiled softly. The moment Richard mentioned historical trust law, I suspected. Grace's expression filled with regret. Why did you not say anything? Ethan shrugged gently. Because you have spent months carrying burdens that belong to everyone else. I was not about to add another one. Lily wandered over at that exact moment carrying a tiny wooden birdhouse Noah had helped her build the day before. Daddy, she said brightly. Look. We finished it. Ethan smiled warmly. It looks perfect. Lily held it proudly toward Grace. Miss Grace painted the flowers. Grace accepted the little birdhouse with trembling hands. Its roof was slightly uneven. One side leaned a little. Tiny blue flowers decorated the front beneath a hand-painted heart. It was far from perfect. It was beautiful anyway. Ethan looked at Lily. Why did you make this? Lily answered with complete sincerity. Because birds need somewhere safe to come home. Grace closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them again, tears shimmered quietly beneath the afternoon sunlight. She turned back toward Richard. I have made my decision. Every conversation stopped. Richard folded his hands respectfully. We are listening. Grace too, the days that followed unfolded with a quiet grace no one could have planned. The legal teams returned to the city carrying new instructions instead of old arguments. Richard remained only long enough to shake Ethan's hand once more before promising that every document would reflect Grace's decision exactly as she had spoken it beneath the old oak tree. One by one the vehicles disappeared down the gravel road until only the familiar sounds of the countryside remained. The wind rustled through the maple leaves. A rooster crowed somewhere beyond the neighboring fields. The farmhouse settled once again into the peaceful rhythm it had begun to remember. Ethan stood on the front porch watching the dust slowly disappear into the distance. Beside him, Lily leaned comfortably against his arm. Are they all gone? She asked. Ethan nodded. Yes, sweetheart. Lily smiled. It feels quiet again. Ethan looked toward the garden where Grace and Noah were gathering the last baskets of vegetables before sunset. Sometimes quiet is the nicest gift life gives us. Grace heard his words and smiled softly without turning around. For the first time in many years, silence no longer felt lonely. It felt safe. Over the following weeks, life found its own gentle routine. Every weekday morning Ethan and Noah repaired another small piece of the farm. Together they rebuilt the chicken coop, replaced weathered porch railings, restored the old windmill beside the well, and repaired the weathered wooden sign at the entrance of the property. Noah possessed an extraordinary patience with old things. He never rushed a repair. He believed every beam, every hinge, and every weathered board deserved the opportunity to remain useful. Ethan admired that about him. More than once he caught himself thinking that Noah reminded him of the son he had never known he wanted. Grace divided her time between the farmhouse and occasional trips into the city. Bennett Legacy Holdings still required her leadership, but everything about the company slowly began to change. Board meetings grew shorter. Community projects grew larger. Old family farms scheduled for demolition were restored instead. Scholarship programs expanded across rural counties. Employees noticed something unusual. Their new chairwoman spent less time discussing quarterly profits and far more time asking whether local families were thriving. Some executives quietly questioned the changes. Most simply watched as productivity increased anyway. Richard often smiled during meetings without saying why. He knew exactly where those ideas had been born. Every Friday afternoon Grace returned to the farmhouse before sunset, no matter how busy the week had been. She always arrived carrying something simple. Fresh bread from a small bakery. Apple cider from a neighboring orchard. Seeds for next season's garden. She never arrived with expensive gifts because she had learned that the people waiting for her on the porch valued presents far more than presents. Lily began counting Fridays instead of days. "Miss Grace is coming today," she would announce before racing toward the front gate the moment she heard tires on the gravel road. Grace never failed to step out of the vehicle smiling as though she had been the one receiving the welcome. Autumn gradually surrendered to early winter. The first light snowfall covered the fields one quiet December morning, transforming the old farmhouse into something that looked almost timeless. Ethan stood outside shoveling the front walkway when Grace joined him wearing a thick wool coat and knitted gloves. For several minutes they worked side by side without speaking. Finally Grace looked toward the snow-covered pasture. "Do you ever wonder how differently life could have turned out?" Ethan rested both hands on the shovel handle. "Sometimes." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you ever regret buying this place?" Ethan laughed softly. "The roof leaked. The barn almost collapsed. The plumbing still complains every morning." Grace smiled. "That is not what I asked." Ethan became quiet. His eyes drifted toward the kitchen window where Lily and Noah were decorating gingerbread cookies while laughing over something neither adult could hear. Warm candlelight glowed inside the farmhouse despite the cold gathering outside. Ethan finally answered. "The day I bought this place, I thought I was giving my daughter a home." He paused before smiling gently. "I never imagined the home would give us a family." Grace lowered her eyes as emotion quietly filled them once again. She took a slow breath. Before asking the question that had lived inside her heart ever since she first packed her suitcase to return to the city. "If I had never left after everything happened, if I kept coming back every weekend, if someday I stopped leaving at all." She hesitated, suddenly uncertain for perhaps the first time in months. Ethan looked at her patiently. Grace's voice became almost a whisper. "Would this still feel like home?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead he reached down, brushed a thin layer of fresh snow from the old porch railing, and looked across the fields glowing beneath the pale winter sun. "Home is not the place that asks where you came from," he said quietly. "It is the place that hopes you stay." Grace closed her eyes for just a moment, as tears warmed her cold cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow. They were the quiet tears that arrived when someone finally stopped running. Before either of them could say another word, the farmhouse door burst open. Lily hurried outside wearing boots that were far too big for her, holding 3 mugs of steaming hot chocolate. She looked from Ethan to Grace with a smile bright enough to outshine the winter sky. "You two are going to catch cold," she declared. "Families are supposed to drink hot chocolate together." Neither Ethan nor Grace corrected the single word that mattered most. They simply accepted the warm mugs, walked back toward the old farmhouse side by side, and quietly stepped through the front door where laughter, candlelight, and second chances were already waiting for them. Spring arrived quietly, almost as if the old farmhouse had invited it back one blossom at a time. The snow melted into rich black soil, the orchards awakened beneath warm April sunshine, and rows of young vegetables stretched across the garden where Grace and Lily had planted tiny seeds only weeks before. The weathered porch that once leaned beneath years of neglect now stood proudly after countless evenings of patient repairs. Fresh white paint reflected the morning light, flower boxes overflowed with bright red geraniums, and the little birdhouse Lily had built with Noah rested beneath the old oak tree where bluebirds had chosen to nest. It was difficult for anyone passing along County Road 14 to believe the property had once been considered abandoned. Yet the greatest transformation had never been the farmhouse itself. It had always been the people inside. Nearly 1 year had passed since Ethan first unlocked the old front door expecting nothing more than an empty house. Instead, life had quietly placed a family where he had expected only silence. Every Saturday morning followed a familiar rhythm. Ethan cooked pancakes while Lily insisted on adding blueberries whether anyone asked for them or not. Noah repaired whatever happened to squeak, rattle, or lean that week, usually before anyone else noticed it needed attention. Grace arrived home from the city every Friday evening and rarely left before Monday morning, although those weekends gradually became longer until eventually nobody bothered counting how many days she remained. Bennett Legacy Holdings flourished under her leadership, not because she chased larger numbers but because she remembered the lesson written on the back of an old photograph. Land was never truly owned. It was entrusted to people willing to love it well. Employees noticed that every major meeting now began with a simple question. Who will this decision help? At first the board found the question unusual. Eventually they found it impossible to imagine leading without it. Richard Collins often smiled quietly from the far end of the conference table, knowing the greatest investment the company had ever made was not measured in dollars but in character. The restored farmhouse also became something unexpected for the surrounding community. Families facing difficult seasons were invited for Sunday dinners. Local teenagers learned woodworking from Noah inside the rebuilt barn. Elderly neighbors shared gardening advice with Grace beneath the orchard trees. Children laughed across fields where weeds had once grown untouched. Nobody advertised any of it. They simply opened the front door whenever someone needed a place to breathe again. Harold Simmons liked telling newcomers that the old Carter place had finally remembered what it was built for. Even Martha Jenkins, who had once questioned the strangers living there, admitted one afternoon while carrying homemade pie across the porch that she had never been happier to discover she had been wrong about someone. Lily continued growing in ways that quietly amazed everyone around her. The little girl who had once clung tightly to Ethan's hand whenever entering unfamiliar places now raced confidently through the orchards, her laughter carried across the fields by every spring breeze. She still spoke to flowers exactly as her mother once had. She still believed birds deserved beautiful homes. And every evening before dinner she still thanked God for one blessing from the day. Sometimes it was sunshine. Sometimes it was fresh strawberries. Sometimes it was simply hearing Noah laugh after fixing another impossible project. One warm evening near the end of May, the family gathered beneath the old oak tree while fireflies slowly appeared across the pasture. Ethan had finished hanging a wooden porch swing earlier that afternoon, and Grace sat beside him watching Lily chase butterflies while Noah adjusted a fence gate in the distance. Neither adult spoke for several peaceful minutes. The world around them seemed complete without needing many words. Finally Grace looked toward Ethan with the same quiet smile she had worn the day she first accepted a cup of tea in his kitchen. "Do you remember the first morning we met?" she asked softly. Ethan laughed. "I remember thinking someone had moved into my house." Grace smiled wider. "And I remember thinking we had reached the end of our journey." Ethan slowly shook his head. "Turns out we were only standing at the beginning." Grace rested her hand gently over his. There was no need for promises spoken aloud. Life had already answered the question both of them carried for so long. Love had arrived quietly, not through grand speeches or impossible miracles, but through shared breakfasts, repaired fences, ordinary kindness, and the courage to trust again. Lily suddenly turned and ran toward them holding another bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the edge of the field. She stopped in front of Grace, smiled with complete innocence, and said the words that caused the entire evening to fall into gentle silence. "Happy Mother's Day." Grace looked at the little bouquet, then at Lily's hopeful face, before tears quietly filled her eyes. She knelt and wrapped Lily in the warmest embrace she could give. Ethan stood nearby, unable to speak as memories of Hannah gently settled beside gratitude instead of sorrow. There was no guilt inside his heart anymore, only thankfulness for every chapter that had led them here. Above them, the branches of the old oak tree swayed softly in the evening breeze while bluebirds flew in and out of the tiny birdhouse built by loving hands. The farmhouse no longer waited for strangers. It welcomed family. The abandoned fields no longer whispered about forgotten years. They celebrated second chances. And somewhere beyond the quiet horizon, where golden sunlight disappeared into endless rows of green, it almost felt as though the generations who had once loved that land were smiling too, because the greatest inheritance had never been measured by acres, wealth, or titles. It had always been the simple courage to open a door, offer kindness without asking for anything in return, and discover that sometimes the people who arrive as strangers become the miracle that was quietly waiting to come home.